Claire Simmons had lived in Maple Ridge, a quiet suburban town in Oregon, for almost 7 years. Life with her husband, David, was steady, calm, and predictable in a comforting way. They had their routines: morning coffee together, evening walks, and weekend dinners with neighbors. Nothing dramatic ever happened on their street. The biggest excitement was usually when someone bought a new car or repainted their house. So when a new neighbor moved into the small blue home across the yard in late summer, it felt like the whole street suddenly woke up. His name was Evan Miller, a man in his mid-30s with a calm, thoughtful presence. He kept to himself, waved politely whenever he crossed paths with anyone, and always carried a faint, distant look in his eyes, like he was lost in thoughts no one knew about. Claire first noticed him on a warm Friday evening when she and David sat on their porch, watching the sun lower behind the trees. The air smelled of pine and grilled food. Kids played 2 houses down. It was an ordinary day until Claire's eyes drifted toward the blue house. One window was open. Not halfway, not slightly. Wide open. Inside, warm light painted the room in a soft glow. Evan sat at a wooden table with a book in his hands. The moment felt peaceful, like watching a scene from a quiet movie. He wasn't doing anything unusual, but the openness of the window made it look like he didn't mind being seen. Or maybe he didn't care if anyone noticed him at all. Claire didn't think anything of it then. She simply observed him for a moment before turning back to her tea. Life went on, but the next evening the same thing happened. And the evening after that? And the one after that, every night when the sun dipped and the neighborhood softened into shadows. Evan's window glowed like a small lighthouse across the yard. The curtains stayed pulled back, and the air inside always looked calm and warm. Sometimes Evan read quietly. Sometimes he painted on a small easel. Sometimes he stood near the window, gazing outside like he was searching for something he couldn't name. Claire found herself noticing it more often than she expected. It wasn't fascination in a romantic way. It was something softer, something she couldn't easily define. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe sympathy. Maybe the recognition of loneliness, even if he hid it behind polite smiles and quiet routines. David noticed too. One night, as they sat with mugs of chamomile tea, he said in a slow voice, "He keeps it open every single night. Not sure if he wants someone to see him or if he just likes fresh air." Claire shrugged lightly, not wanting to sound too interested. Maybe he likes the light, or maybe his place gets stuffy. But inside, she wondered. She sensed something unspoken about Evan. Something gentle and slightly sad. Their evenings began to include quiet glances toward that window. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't spying. It was more like checking on a neighbor the same way people check the weather naturally, without much thought. Sometimes they didn't even talk. They just sat close, sipping tea while the golden glow from across the yard became part of their routine. As the days passed, Claire began to notice small details. Evan read thick novels. He painted landscapes, mostly mountains and forests. He paced when he was stressed. He ran his hand through his hair when he tried to focus. All innocent, everyday things, yet each moment carried emotions she felt but couldn't explain. It was as if the window showed pieces of a life he didn't share with anyone. Then one night, something different happened while she and David sat on the porch swing, the air cool with the first hints of autumn. Evan looked up directly at them, not for long, not dramatically, just a moment of eye contact across the yard. Enough to make Claire's breath catch. Enough to make David straighten in his seat. Evan didn't smile or wave. He simply looked softly, thoughtfully before returning to his book. It was surprising how that small moment changed the feeling in the air. Until then, the window had been something they observed from afar. But now it felt like Evan knew they saw him, knew they noticed him, and he didn't seem bothered. If anything, his eyes carried gratitude, as if being noticed made him feel a little less alone. The next day passed quietly. Claire went to work at the local library, shelving books and helping students find research articles. David fixed a leaky pipe in the kitchen. Life moved normally. But that evening, something inside Claire felt subtly different. She found herself thinking about the window at odd times during lunch, while driving home, even while folding laundry. She wondered what Evan's story was, why he lived alone, why he spent evenings reading under warm light instead of going out like most people his age. When dusk arrived, Shri stepped outside with David, a small flicker of anticipation inside her. She wouldn't admit it out loud, not even to herself, but she was curious to see if the window was open again. Except it wasn't. The curtains were drawn. The light was off. The window was shut tight. The house looked empty, silent, cold. Claire blinked, thinking maybe Evan had arrived late. But as the minutes passed, nothing changed. For the first time since he moved in, there was no gentle light across the yard. She felt a small, surprising tug in her chest. Disappointment. Not dramatic, not painful, but real. A quiet ache she couldn't justify. David noticed her glance. "Maybe he's out tonight," he said casually. "Yeah." "Maybe," she replied, but she didn't feel convinced. The window stayed closed the next day and the day after. Claire tried to ignore the growing sense of concern building inside her. She didn't want to seem dramatic, and she didn't want to admit how much the absence bothered her. But it did. She found herself checking the yard through the kitchen window while cooking, hoping to see a light turn on. She listened for a car door. She waited for anything that suggested Evan was all right by the third night. She felt restless. While she and David sat outside, she finally whispered, "I hope he's okay." David looked at her with a gentle expression, not suspicious, just thoughtful. He had noticed how the missing window light affected her. "You care," he said softly. "You always care about people. That's not a bad thing." Claire looked down. "It's strange. I barely know him." "Doesn't change the fact he looked lonely," David replied. "Anyone would worry." She nodded. It made sense, but it didn't settle the feeling inside her that night. She stayed on the porch longer than usual, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The sky was dark, the moon hidden behind drifting clouds. The blue house remained silent, but then, just as she stood to go inside, a soft flicker appeared. The light in Evan's window. She froze. Slowly, the curtains opened just a little, and then, like a familiar scene returning, Ven stepped into view. He didn't hold a book this time. He didn't paint. He just stood near the window, shoulders slightly slumped, hair messy like he had been thinking too hard. He looked tired. He looked human. He looked like someone carrying a quiet weight. Something inside Claire softened instantly. Evan lifted his gaze toward their porch. His face carried no dramatic expression, just a small, weary look. As if he wasn't sure he should be seen, but was grateful not to be invisible. Claire held his gaze for a moment before looking toward David, who watched with the same gentle concern. The window hadn't just been open for them to see. It had been open because Evan didn't want to feel alone in a new town. And now that Claire understood that, she felt something shift quietly inside her, something warm, protective, and deeply human. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But she knew one thing. That window was no longer just a window. It was the beginning of a story none of them had expected. The rain came early that evening, soft but steady, drumming on the roofs and sprinkling the sidewalks. Maple Ridge smelled of wet earth and pine, a clean, fresh scent that made the streets feel new again. Claire wrapped herself in a warm blanket on the porch, sitting beside David as they listened to the steady rhythm of water. The street was quieter than usual. The kids had gone inside. Neighbors were tucked in their homes. The street lights cast golden pools on the wet asphalt, and everything felt hushed, almost expectant. For 2 nights, Evan Miller's window had remained closed. The blue house across the yard had seemed empty, dark, almost lifeless. Claire had checked it more times than she would admit. The absence of that soft glow in the evenings had left a strange emptiness in her chest, a tiny ache that kept growing. She hadn't realized how much that window, that quiet presence across the yard, had become part of her evenings, part of her sense of normalcy. David noticed the change too. "You've been staring at that window too much," he said lightly, trying to make her laugh. "It's just a house." Claire shook her head, smiling faintly. It's not just a house. He's just lonely. David didn't respond, only nodded, letting the thought linger between them. Neither needed to say more. They both knew what it felt like to recognize someone else's quiet sorrow. The rain grew heavier, a soft, continuous rhythm that made the world feel smaller. Enclosed, intimate. Claire hugged her knees, watching the street and waiting, almost unconsciously, for a light to appear in that blue house. And then it came. A flicker. A soft, golden flicker that grew brighter until the window was illuminated with warmth. Claire's heart lifted in a way she couldn't explain. The curtains moved slightly, and for a moment, the world beyond that porch, the wet streets, the quiet homes, the gentle rain seemed to vanish. There he was, Evan Miller, standing by the window. Not reading, not painting, not holding anything. Just standing, hands in pockets, shoulders slightly hunched, his posture quiet but deliberate. He looked out at them, not dramatically, not demanding attention, just looking. And in that look, there was an invitation, gentle and unspoken. Claire felt it in her chest, a soft tug, a strange warmth, a recognition that this was a man who needed to be seen. David nudged her gently. He's back, he said softly, as if acknowledging something important but fragile. Claire didn't answer. She only watched, frozen in the moment. The rain blurred the edges of the yard, making Evan's figure seem almost like a painting, a soft image of solitude framed by warm light. He stayed there, standing still, letting the quiet stretch between them. Claire noticed little details she hadn't before. The way his hair fell over his forehead, the slight curve of his shoulders, the calm tension in his hands. He looked human in a way that spoke volumes, vulnerable, quiet. And waiting. She realized in that instant that the window wasn't just open for her and David to see. It was open because he needed to feel seen. David whispered again, "I think he wants someone to notice him." Claire nodded, though she didn't speak aloud. It wasn't about curiosity anymore. It was about connection, the fragile, unspoken kind that comes slowly but stays. They had no words to offer him. Only the silent acknowledgement that someone across the yard was there. Someone who carried quiet weight. Someone who mattered even in his solitude. The rain fell harder. The wind shook the tree branches, tapping against the windows, and for a moment, it felt like the world was holding its breath. Evan finally moved slightly, leaning closer to the open window, looking out with a careful, hesitant gaze. Claire felt a strange urge to respond, to say something, to let him know he wasn't alone, but words didn't come. They weren't necessary. David finally stood, moving a step closer to Claire. "Why don't we invite him over?" he asked quietly, almost as if speaking too loudly would shatter the moment. Claire looked at him, surprised. "Invite him now." "Yes," David said, his voice calm. "He seems like he could use company, and we can offer that. Just for a little while." Claire hesitated. She had never imagined inviting a neighbor into their home like this. It felt bold, intimate, and slightly risky, but something in Evan's presence, in the quiet honesty of his gaze, made it feel right. "Okay," she said softly, her heart racing a little. David stepped forward, raising his voice gently over the rain. "Evan, are you okay? We were wondering if you want to come over for a bit, stay dry, have some tea." The movement at the window froze. Claire felt a tiny spike of worry. Had they overstepped? Had they broken some fragile balance? Then Evan's lips curved into the smallest, faintest smile of relief, of gratitude, of quiet happiness. He nodded slowly. I would like that," he said. His voice was soft, almost unsure. But there was sincerity in it that made Claire's heart flutter. David waved toward the gate. "Come on in. Don't worry about the rain." Within minutes, Evan appeared at their porch, slightly wet but smiling faintly. His coat was damp, clinging lightly to his frame, and his hair was messy. But there was a gentle warmth in his eyes that made it impossible not to like him instantly. "Thank you," he said quietly. Stepping inside, Claire gestured toward the living room. Tea's ready. You don't have to say more than that. The three of them sat down together, the storm outside creating a cocoon of privacy. The room smelled faintly of chamomile and clean linen. David poured the tea, careful not to spill, and Evan held his cup with both hands, savoring the warmth, watching the steam rise. They didn't speak immediately. They didn't need to. The comfort of shared silence filled the space. Rain drummed against the windows, soft and continuous, but inside, the air felt safe, calm, and intimate in a way that Claire hadn't expected. Evan finally spoke. It's nice, he said, voice hesitant. Not many people notice or care. Claire's chest tightened. She wanted to tell him that she cared, that David cared, that they saw him exactly as he was, that they understood. But words weren't necessary. The warmth in their eyes, the way they stayed close without speaking, said enough. They talked after a while, small things at first. About the weather, about books they liked, about life in Maple Ridge. Nothing dramatic, nothing heavy. But every word carried weight. Each laugh, each small acknowledgement, each careful question was like building a bridge between lives that had run parallel but never crossed. Claire noticed that Evan was thoughtful, kind, and quietly funny. David noticed how much Evan seemed to appreciate the small gestures, the tea poured just right, the blanket draped over a shoulder, the quiet smiles that didn't demand response but gave comfort anyway. Time passed. The rain lessened and the world outside softened. The blue house across the yard no longer felt like a distant place. It was connected in a quiet, emotional way to their home and hearts. As the evening drew to a close, Evan stood to leave. He didn't speak much, just a quiet, heartfelt thank you. And when he stepped back outside, even as the rain had stopped, he paused by his window again, giving a small wave before disappearing into his house. Claire watched him go, her heart full of a strange, gentle warmth. The window open once more had brought them together, even if only for a brief evening. It wasn't romantic in a dramatic sense. It wasn't about passion or desire. It was about human connection, the quiet kind that makes people feel less alone. The kind that lingers even when someone leaves the room. David took her hand as they watched the street, now quiet and gleaming in the soft moonlight. He's all right, he said softly. And now he knows he's not invisible. Claire nodded, squeezing his hand. I think we helped. More than we thought. For the first time in days, she felt a lightness in her chest. The blue house, the open window, Evan's quiet presence had all become part of their lives now. Part of their understanding of what it meant to care for someone without expectation, to notice without judgment, to offer companionship without asking for anything in return. She realized that sometimes people open windows for reasons deeper than air or light. Sometimes windows are opened because someone needs to be seen. And sometimes, if you're lucky, someone notices and a small, meaningful connection is formed that changes evenings, hearts and lives quietly, gently, beautifully. That night, Claire and David sat on their porch a little longer, sipping the last of their tea, watching the streetlights reflect on wet asphalt, feeling a calmness they hadn't realized they were missing. Across the yard, the blue house's window glowed faintly, promising that tomorrow might bring another chance to connect, another quiet story waiting to unfold. And as Claire leaned against David, she understood something important. Life sometimes gives small, gentle moments that change hearts quietly, without fanfare or drama. And those are often the moments worth noticing the most. The window was no longer just a window. It was a doorway. And for Claire, David, and Evan, that doorway had just begun to open.